In the last video, we learned that every book of the Bible has a primary audience, and that you and I, we are the secondary audience. You see, the whole Bible is for us, but before it is for us, it is for them, for the primary audience. And unless we understand that, unless we are able to discern how the passage of Scripture applied to that primary audience first, we will never understand how it applies to you and me today. Or we will be introducing false things into the Scripture by applying it to us in a way which is unnatural and the primary audience would not have understood. So it is important that we learn to separate ourselves from that primary audience in order to have the correct interpretation of Scripture. This concept is the most important concept that I can teach you in how to understand to read the Bible, is learning about the primary audience and how to distinguish the way that it applied to them versus the way that it's going to apply to you and to me today. I want to give you a perfect example of this. If you ask any Christian what is their favorite passage of Scripture, it is going to be Jeremiah 29:11. You all know this verse by memory. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Now, you all know this verse by heart, right? Now, the way that most people will interpret this verse is this: yeah, Lord, I have wonderful plans for me too. What a coincidence. You and I have awesome plans for me. We are in the same boat because we both want awesome things for myself. Now that is the wrong way to interpret Scripture because we are inserting ourselves as the primary audience. And this is a perfect example of how this error can play out. When we read this verse in this manner, it introduces all kinds of unnatural meanings that did not apply to the Scripture. So let's learn how to separate ourselves from this. Let's do this exercise together as a group. In fact, I want you to read this verse, but I want you to read it in context, beginning with verse 4 and ending with verse 14. See if you can identify in these verses who is the primary audience. And number 2, what are the circumstances or purpose for why God wrote this? These are both skills that you learned in the last video. Go ahead and take a minute to answer this with your group. Okay, so in verse 4, we read, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So we learn that the primary audience is a Jewish audience. It is the people of Israel who have been taken away from their homeland in Jerusalem and are now living in exile in Babylon. So unless you are Jewish, unless you are Jewish and lived in Jerusalem, unless you are Jewish, lived in Jerusalem, and are now living in exile in Babylon, then you are not the primary audience of this text. You and I are the secondary audience. Now, this text will apply to you and to me, but it will apply to you and to me as a secondary audience. And we first need to understand how it applied to them as the primary audience. You see, when you read this text, did you find the purpose for why God wrote this? You learned about the primary audience, but have you been able to identify the purpose? If you didn't, go ahead and hit pause on this video now. If you got the answer, then we will continue going. Look at verse 13 and 14. It says, You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exiles. God is letting these Jewish exiles know that they are not going to be in exile forever. It says that God is the one who put them into exile to begin with. So you see, this passage of scripture of, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, makes sense in this context because the Jewish people might have felt that God did want to harm them since He's the one that put them into exile. The meaning is totally different now because they need to know that God has not abandoned them. The meaning is that even though God did put them into exile, that it was just for a season and that there is still a future hope and a plan for them. You see, there is a danger when we look at any passage of Scripture and we ignore the primary audience. When we make ourselves into the primary audience, we are almost always introducing error into the Scripture and introducing an unnatural interpretation. Whenever we make ourselves into the primary audience, we can make any verse of Scripture mean pretty much whatever we want. For example, Jeremiah 29:11, if I was to be the primary audience and ignore the original Jewish audience, I could mean it to be that God has wonderful plans to prosper me. I could make it mean that He wants to give me money and a house and a Ferrari because it says He wants to prosper me, just me, personally. We all understand that that would be an error, but that's exactly what we're doing when we ignore the original application for the original audience. We must learn to separate ourselves from that audience. So, how can you and I apply this verse to ourselves? If you and I are the secondary audience, then how do I know the proper interpretation for you and for me versus that primary audience? I want to give you a rule and write this down. The correct application of any passage must make sense to the primary audience as well. Let me say that again. When you and I are applying a scripture to ourselves, the application must make sense to that primary audience as well as for you and for me. We call this the transcendent truth. You see, there is a truth that applies only to that primary audience at that time in that place. But then there is a bigger truth, a transcendent truth, which applies to all people in different cultures and different times. It transcends time and culture. Let's look at this idea together. Take a minute with your group and looking back at this text, at Jeremiah 29:11, and taking into consideration the context that we just read. See if you can identify what does Jeremiah 29:11 mean specifically and only to that group of people living in that place in that time. And number two, see if you can then identify what is the bigger truth, the transcendent truth that can apply to them and to us today. Go ahead and take a minute to discuss with your group. Now, if you had difficulty with that last assignment, don't worry. We're going to do more exercises together that are going to help us develop this skill. The truth that applied only to those people at that time is that they were Jewish people living in exile in Babylon, and God wanted them specifically to know that their exile was going to come to an end soon. But the transcendent truth, the truth that transcends culture and time, that is equally true for them and equally true for us, is this: that you and I might not be living in exile, but you and I do find ourselves in difficult circumstances at times. And the transcendent truth is that God does not forget you when you are in that difficult time, and He remembers you. And while the circumstances you might be in are difficult, you can be sure of this: that God has a plan for you, and that plan is a good plan. Now, let's shape this skill further by looking at another favorite passage of many Christians that they love to quote. And this is Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. Now, the way that many people erroneously interpret this passage is that you and I, living in the 21st century, can do anything that we set our minds to if we just have faith in Jesus. So, if I want to dunk basketballs like Michael Jordan, all I have to do is have faith, because Jesus will give me that ability to dunk like Michael Jordan. Or if I have a work assignment that is difficult and I'm looking to get a promotion at work, all I need is to have faith, because Jesus is going to give me success in that work assignment to get my promotion. Now, this would be the wrong way to interpret this scripture, and we would be introducing all kinds of errors into it. And yet, this is how many people look at it, because they have not learned the skill of separating themselves from the primary audience and learning how it applied to them and how it applies to us. So let's see if we can do this together by looking at this verse in context. I want you to write down the following verses of Scripture and then read them together with your group or with your family and see if we can identify a few things. The verses that I want you to read are Philippians 1:1, Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 through 14, and then Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 15. Go ahead and take a minute with your group to read these scriptures together, and then make a list of the following things. Who is the author of this letter? Number 2, who is the primary audience of this letter? And number 3, this one will take you a little bit more. What are the circumstances that are specific to just that author and that audience that are not applicable to us today? This third one is important. You're going to write down anything that is specific to just those people at that time that are not the same for you and me today. This includes geography. It includes different situations that they might be in. It includes economic situations as well. Go ahead and take a minute to study those passages and write those things down. Okay, so beginning with chapter 1, verse 1, we quickly learn that Paul is the author of this letter, and that he is writing this letter to Christians who are living in the city of Philippi 2,000 years ago. So that is the primary audience. So whenever we see the word you, the pronoun you in this letter, we know that it's not talking about you and me today in the 21st century, but Paul is talking about Christians living in Philippi 2,000 years ago. And whenever we see the pronoun I, we know that it's also not you and I sitting here today, but he's talking about himself. Paul is the I in this scripture. So when the passage reads, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, we understand that the I is Paul, not you and not me. Now, what are the circumstances regarding this letter? That was the third thing I asked you to do. That one might have taken you a little bit more time. Let's see. In chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, we learn that Paul is in chains. And he mentions palace guard. So the circumstances of this passage is that Paul is writing this letter from prison. In chapters 4, verses 11 and 12, Paul mentions that he may be in need, perhaps even hunger, but not to worry, that he has learned to be content in all things, and whether it be in need or in plenty. So now let's work together one more time to see if we can find out what is the truth that applied only to Paul and this audience at that time. And then let us see if we can find the truth that transcends, the bigger truth that applies both to Paul and to us today. So let's take a minute with your group to discuss this. Number one, the statement, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. How does that apply specifically to Paul and just to Paul in those circumstances 2,000 years ago? And number two, I want you to discuss, how does that statement, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me, how can it apply both to Paul and to us today? And that will be the truth that transcends. Go ahead and take a minute to discuss with your group. Okay, so by looking at the circumstances that are just specific to Paul, we can know that the truth that is applicable to that first audience is this. Paul is in prison and he is hungry and in need, and he says the statement, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. What he really means is that he can endure even the discomfort of prison and of lacking things for the sake of the gospel. Now, it's important to add that he's in prison for the sake of the gospel, not for stealing cars. Now, this is important for you and I today as we learn what is the transcendent truth. What is the truth that applies both to Paul and to us? Because hopefully you and I are not in prison today, and hopefully we are not in such dire circumstances where we are lacking food, but you and I do often find ourselves in difficult circumstances. And it could be that you and I find ourselves in difficult circumstances because of the sake of the gospel. Maybe you've lost some friends or even family because of your faith in Jesus. Or maybe there are things that you used to do which you are no longer able to participate in because of your faith in Jesus. Well, the way that this applies to you today, that you can do all things through Christ that strengthens you, is that you can be sure that if God has put you into a difficult circumstance for the sake of his name and the sake of the gospel, you can be sure that he will empower you through that circumstance and that he's going to give you the endurance to overcome. That is the transcendent truth. That is equally true both for Paul 2,000 years ago and for you today. That is the truth that transcends culture and time. Now, that's the end of this video. Next time, we are going to be looking at context clues. We are going to be investigating the passage very closely to look for clues that will help us to interpret the passage into your life and mine. See you then.